having an interview with Dr. Anna Taylor, who's from the African Centre for Cities at the University of Cape Town. Anna, welcome and thanks for making yourself available. I wonder if you could just start by explaining how you've become so knowledgeable about the climate responses that are happening in the city of Cape Town.
Thanks very much for having me, Mark. Yes, well, I was lucky enough to be part of a program called the Mr. Urban Futures program, which had as part of it this idea of embedded research. And so I was an embedded researcher that worked within the city of Cape Town, so our city government effectively, as part of my PhD process. So between 2012 and 2015, I spent as much as the equivalent of about 7 months of the year in and out working within the local government. And that was an opportunity to get obviously very up close and personal and work side by side with city officials and politicians. And so the work involved, going through a lot of their documentation, doing a whole number of interviews, attending lots of meetings, and basically just doing work, as I say, alongside them that gave me the opportunity to see firsthand what's happening in terms of responding to climate variability and change within the city of Cape Town from a local government perspective.
So you probably got quite a good sense of the history of how climate change has been taken on within the city context, then. Perhaps you could just summarize very briefly, sort of, I don't know whether it's the last 10 or the last 20 years of progress that the city has made in grappling with climate change issues.
Sure. So I dated back definitely to around 2000, 2001. So it is 17 odd years, going on 20 years. It is quite specific to the South African context because around 2000 was when local governments and particularly metropolitan governments in South Africa were given much broader expanded mandates. So there was a lot of devolution from national government to local government. And so it was a time of huge restructuring within all of South Africa's cities in terms of how local government worked there. But one of the early things they did was develop what was the Integrated Metropolitan Environment Policy for Cape Town. And within that, you see the first reference to climate change. Very briefly and sort of without much substance to it, but there's a recognition that climate change is recognized within the city as something that's on at least the environment agenda, if nothing else. And then from there, it sort of slowly progresses. It's primarily been taken up in the environmental management space, and so I think the city's environmental resource management department have been a real key driver in getting climate change onto the agenda. And definitely for sort of the first 10 years, it was largely with a mitigation orientation to start with, which I think reflects the broader international sort of discourse around climate change, which had a very much a greenhouse gas emissions focus. But in Cape Town, interestingly, it was linked very early on to the energy poverty agenda. So it was less around sort of reducing emissions from high emitters, but more thinking how could the climate change agenda be used to further the sort of the access for all to energy services and resources within a South African city.
So it was kind of looking for development co-benefits, if you like, rather than it being a climate change driven thing. It was using climate change as an excuse to as a rationale for doing something that had development.
No, I think and it started then creeping into many sort of sectors or departments within the city, but usually as sort of an additional layer, as another reason for doing what they were doing anyway, which usually had to do with service delivery, economic development, those sorts of issues. So I'd say in the sort of mid-2000s, 2005-06, then the adaptation agenda really picked up. And interestingly, initially it was related particularly to coastal management. So there was quite a focus on sea level rise and trying to figure out what sea level rise meant in the context of Cape Town, and doing some quite detailed sort of research-based assessments on what the risks would be, which areas might be more prone to flooding, what kind of public infrastructure might be impacted, what the costs associated with that would be. And then I'd say the agenda sort of expanded from there into water management, stormwater management. And so you see the agenda sort of going beyond just the traditional environmental management function into other areas of the city. And then I'd say it's really exploded over the last 5 years. So with the sort of initiation of a lot of international agreements, but also networks. So things like the C40, the Resilient Cities Network. Cape Town's really been positioned on the international stage as a city that acts on climate change, and that's really increased the attention and the sort of emphasis that's being placed on it. So you see a kind of a slow uptake and interest in climate change being layered onto the development agenda, the local government agenda in the 2000s. And then I'd say since maybe 2011 was when Durban hosted the Conference of Parties, which brought a lot of attention nationally to climate change. So I think that, again, sort of ignited a whole lot of additional interest within the city who bid to host that. So a lot of attention was given to it. And then from there, it's really been sort of an exponential growth, I'd say, in terms of the agenda and how much traction it's getting within the city.
So one of the things that we've sort of been discovering throughout the course is that there are very few instances where adaptation itself is a standalone activity. Probably 90% of what happens in adaptation is actually just building climate considerations into existing protocols, practices, actions on the ground. And I just wondered where the City of Cape Town sat in that spectrum. Have there been efforts to sort of mainstream climate considerations into what's being done across all of the different functions, or not? And to what extent has that been successful, do you think?
I think, interestingly, again, it has had to be a real mix of some standalone attention that has been given to it as a topic, and establishing documents and committees and groupings that deal with climate change and climate adaptation as a standalone topic in order to get the attention and the understanding required. But then definitely mainstreaming has been a sort of a component that has meant that it gained traction because a lot of the technical capacity and the budgets go to existing functions within the city, which are not climate adaptation specific. So it has been about layering climate adaptation into infrastructure activities, different, disaster risk management, stormwater, health to some extent, public engagement and awareness raising. So all those things, as you say, climate change becomes a consideration within that. And I find in some ways it's useful to think about adaptation not as, it often doesn't look like something new and different that you're doing. It's more why you're doing that has climate change built in as a consideration, that you've given the thought to why this is robust against possible climate futures and not just how we've seen the climate in the past. So I think adaptation almost becomes more, you observe it in the rationale for why things are being done than necessarily seeing them as very different kinds of activities that you do.
So that gets to this idea of, I guess, that we've talked about in the course already, is around governance, and the fact that having collaborative governance is probably and institutional arrangements is really important, because no single entity within the city space can probably do it on its own. It requires different skill sets and mandates and responsibilities to pull it all together, if you like, and create that continuity.
And the pooling of budgets as well, because often that's the problem, is the silo effect appears in so many ways. Expertise are broken down, budgets are broken down. So I think one thing that the city has done quite effectively over the last few years is start to try and build a more strategic mission for themselves that break down some of those silos. And the climate change agenda has benefited from the city's efforts at becoming a more, what they refer to it as transversal management. And so climate change has been able to, the climate change agenda has been able to achieve some more prominence because that process has been ongoing in terms of the way they've been reorganizing the organization to work in more cross-cutting ways.
So do you think that what the city's been doing in the adaptation space over the last, it's certainly 15, 17 years now, did that make it better equipped to deal with this crisis, or or did it not make any difference, I guess is the question. So
I'm an optimist, so I think
okay, yeah.
I have to say that in my view, I think it will have put them in a slightly better position, because there has been a long lead up to people starting to recognize what these connections are. So a practical example maybe would be useful. Stormwater. In the water crisis, so previously stormwater, in terms of the water that we get when a heavy rainfall event occurs, there's a department that's main task has been just to get that water out of the city as quickly and as cleanly as possible, because we don't want the city to flood.
Yeah.
And yet there's a growing recognition now that we might need that water. We actually need to harvest more of that water, not just get it out and away from the city as quickly as possible. We need to be connecting that up to the water supply system in novel ways. And so the climate change agenda brought together, in many respects, the people who were working in stormwater, who tended to be engineers and working on infrastructure around pipes to get water away, maybe sort of artificial wetlands to gather rainwater. They then linked up through the climate change agenda. They started talking to the environment department much more about, okay, well, what do changes in rainfall patterns mean for how much stormwater we're going to have to deal with? And there was something called the Climate Change Think Tank in around 2009 to 2011 that linked up the environment people, the stormwater people, and academics, not only at UCT, but also, for example, at the University of KwaZulu-Natal, who started looking at, okay, well, how are rainfall patterns changing in Cape Town? So all of those conversations and those connections had started developing well before this crisis started. I mentioned the city reorganization. A more strategic look at issues. So now, for example, we've had a move. The stormwater department has now moved into sitting with the sort of water supply and management people, based on a recognition that we now need to start thinking differently about harvesting stormwater and feeding that into the water supply system. So that thinking, for example, has come through in terms of some of the ways that we're addressing this crisis. It's not just about building more dams, it's about thinking about rainwater harvesting and wetland rehabilitation. So all of those kind of options that have been considered in how to respond to this crisis, I think are only possible because that groundwork was laid, and part of that groundwork was laid because of the climate change adaptation agenda, that some of those conversations started happening. So I think, you have to look at it under a microscope to join up those dots and piece together how it has put us in a better position. But I mean, I quite confidently say it has made it, increased our chances of getting through this crisis more effectively.
So I want to just finish off by sort of asking you a tricky question, I think, but we often hear this term climate resilience or climate resilient development, and I wondered if you could sort of summarize what you think that means in what does resilience mean in cities in the context of climate and climate change?
So I think first and foremost it's about the ability to deal with stresses and shocks. So it's about, and when you attach climate to resilience, I mean, the nice thing about resilience is it takes a very broad perspective. Climate is only one of many possible stresses and shocks. But in the case of climate, it might be something like a creeping drought. So that's a good example of a stress where it's quite a gradually accumulating effect, but that can have some quite serious ramifications. And then shocks are things like a sudden flood event, for example. So the idea of resilience is about building a city in a way that it can sort of absorb and recover from experiencing those stresses and shocks more effectively and more easily. And then what we've learned from the resilience sort of theory thinking is that in order to do that, it requires a certain amount of flexibility. So, which is difficult in cities, particularly in governments who are quite rigid, rule-bound organizations. So flexibility doesn't come easily, but resilience is kind of pushing that agenda is don't put all your eggs in one basket. Make sure that you have some funds available to do some more innovative work. Try and you try and adopt a range of options rather. So in the water crisis example, don't just put all your money into desalination. Try and look at rainwater harvesting, water demand management options, desalination, groundwater recharge. So have a range. So flexibility on the one hand, and diversity is another key aspect of the resilience thinking. So both of which challenge city governments, because I think by their nature they tend to be, they have quite. They work in big budgets, and it's easier to put a big budget into a single big infrastructure project. And also that often gets political credence, because it means that a mayor can go and cut the ribbon of a big desalination plant and say to the residents, look, we're really taking your needs seriously. Having lots of little things going on and flexibility is often less, it's harder to manage, and it's harder to make a case for, we're here to look after your best interests. But I think, flexibility and diversity are key concepts within the resilience field. Something that's challenging, I think, within the developing country context that's come out of the resilience thinking is this idea of redundancy. So in a New York case, they talk about, how you have to have additional capacity within your electricity generation system, so that if one power system gets cut, you've got a second one to bring online pretty quickly. It's often hard to make that case here, where resources are scarce and needs are great. But I think the principle still stands, is try and have extra capacity, even if it's, you need to have your capacity deployed all the time, but having people doubling up so that, it's not just the water supply people who are thinking about how best to get water to residents, but it's also the stormwater people who are thinking, that's an example of redundancy that may not have existed before. The stormwater people were only tasked with thinking about drainage, and the water supply people were only thinking about supply. So it's maybe about rethinking redundancy within the characteristics of a developing country city. But I think the resilience agenda, it is bringing a lot of this thinking into city governments, and adding a lot of value, and helping us address crises in new, innovative ways.
Okay, Anna, thanks very much for your time.
Pleasure, Mark. Thank you for having me.